There's a whole lot of money to be made in the world of sports entertainment, and if a wrestler has the talent, the charisma, or just a bit of good luck, then they can be made for life thanks to this strange pseudo-sport we call pro wrestling. But just as soon as that good fortune can be made, then it can be lost as well. And in this video, we're going to take a look at a bunch of wrestlers from all walks of life that reached the top of the industry by making it to WWE or WCW or both, and then lost their money, and in some tragic cases, even worse. The 1990s were the decade that made Sean Waltman, also known as X-Pac, and catapulted him into the mainstream just in time for WWE's most successful period, the Attitude Era. Waltman debuted for WWE back in 1993 during the far less successful New Generation era that came directly before, a time when many of the wrestlers on the roster had a lame and embarrassing gimmick. Waltman managed to avoid being lumbered with a rubbish persona, instead being presented as a fresh-faced youngster trying to make a name for himself in the business. Waltman was christened the 1-2-3 Kid after picking up an upset win against Razor Ramon, and the rest is history. The Kid was an underdog hero that the fans loved. In September 1996, Waltman was unhappy with how little he was getting paid by WWE and decided to defect to WCW instead and start making some real money. His jump to WWE's rival came at exactly the right time, as WCW was gaining momentum thanks to the newly minted NWO angle. After 2 years with WCW as part of the NWO, Waltman defected back to WWE just as the Attitude Era was getting into full swing. WWE's popularity was soaring at the time, and it was here, as part of the D-Generation X faction, that Waltman made his fortune in wrestling. All was not well with Waltman behind the scenes, however. For years his personal life had been marred by drug abuse, and he was becoming more injury prone as the years went on. In fact, it wasn't Waltman's decision to leave WCW, it was boss Eric Bischoff who fired him thanks to his erratic behaviour and increasing drug use. Waltman left WWE in 2002 and went through a tough divorce, causing his drug abuse to worsen. Waltman would eventually have to file for bankruptcy. Upon his debut in WWE in 2005, Joey Mercury was hailed by many as the future of the business alongside tag team partner Johnny Nitro. M&M was the name of their heel tag team alongside manager Melina, and it seemed as though these guys were going to be remembered alongside the all-time great tag teams in wrestling history. However, outside the ring, Mercury was struggling. He'd already been to rehab for his drug problems in early 2006, and worse was yet to come. At the Armageddon pay-per-view in 2006, M&M faced Dave Taylor and William Regal, Paul London and Brian Kendrick, and the Hardy Boys in a 4-way ladder match. During the contest, the usual high-thrill risks were being taken in order to thrill the fans watching on. During the match, Matt Hardy had Nitro and Mercury face down over a ladder before Jeff Hardy jumped onto the other end of it, causing a catapult effect. Mercury was in the wrong place during the manoeuvre. As the ladder was forced upwards, Mercury's face took the full brunt of the blow from the ladder, and as he rolled to the outside of the ring, it was evident that a major injury had occurred. Blood was literally pouring out of his face, and it began to swell up massively. Mercury developed an addiction to painkillers while he was out of action due to the injury, and then WWE released him from his contract. In the years after being fired, Mercury lost his money and his house was on the verge of foreclosure. CM Punk assisted Mercury during this time by purchasing his house mortgage on his behalf and getting him back into WWE as part of his Straight Edge Society faction on TV. Mercury would continue to work in WWE as a producer until 2007, luckily managing to reverse his fortunes after being on the brink of losing absolutely everything. In the cartoon world of 1980s WWE, Jake the Snake Roberts was one of the most believable characters to appear on screen. He had an intensity like no other, as the intensity in his eyes travelled through the camera into your living room every week during his promos. At a time when wrestlers were sweating and gurning their way through coke-fueled promos, Roberts' promos had a quiet intensity and a sense of menace that was unmatched. In the ring, Roberts was one of the best on the roster, where he took that intensity and turned it into physical energy between the ropes. Every move he made meant something psychologically. While Roberts was never a world champion, he existed towards the top end of the card for most of his career. Roberts became unhappy with WWE when Pat Patterson left the booking committee in 1992. It was promised to Roberts that that job would go to him, but the offer never came. Angry, Roberts left WWE for WCW. On screen, Roberts managed to hold things together for years, but in reality, he was spiralling into his substance abuse issues. Eventually, Roberts had to seek help by entering rehab, and then he was fired from WCW. Roberts' problems surrounding drink and drugs stemmed back to his childhood, where he began using substances in his teenage years. As the intensity of his addictions began to grow, his friends and family started to desert him, and he was resorting to harder and harder drugs. As Roberts started to show up at bookings inebriated, his reputation as a crackhead began overshadowing his reputation as being a good worker. Fortunately, the incredible Diamond Dallas Page reached out to Roberts in 2012 and took him under his wing. The resurrection of Jake the Snake began there, and if word is to be believed, he never looked back and is doing better than ever today. Matt Osborne's huge talent as an in-ring performer was often overlooked by fans, who often couldn't see past the gimmick that he's remembered for, Doink the Clown. Osborne brought a ton of nuance to a very difficult role in the early months of its inception in 1992. The original Doink was that of a miserable, conniving clown, closer to evil Pennywise than Ronald McDonald, and Osborne played it perfectly, along with being excellent in the ring. Osborne wrestled Randy Savage and Bret Hart in great matches during this period under the gimmick. Osborne was eventually fired by WWE due to recurring drug offences, leaving other wrestlers to fill the role on WWE TV. In a typically brilliant twist by Paul Heyman, Osborne was brought into ECW, where he played a version of himself, still half dressed as the clown, supposedly driven mad by being forced to play the character of Doink on TV in WWE. Unfortunately, Osborne's real life was spiralling out of control due to his substance abuse issues. He spent all of his money on drugs and eventually passed away in 2013 due to a drug overdose. He was just 55 years old. Lex Luger was one of the 1990s hottest prospects. Lined up as the All-American replacement to Hulk Hogan, WWE tried to push Luger to the moon. Despite managing what dozens of other superstars failed to do in body-slamming Yokozuna on the deck of the USS Intrepid, he just couldn't get over with the fans. WWE even sent Luger around the country on a huge tour bus, but there was just something deeply unlikable about the New York Muscle Man. Luger would return to WCW in the mid-90s just as the company was hotting up. However, a narcotics addiction would eventually catch up to him. Randy Savage's ex-wife, Elizabeth Hewlett, ended up in a relationship with Luger and lived with him in his house, an arrangement that would end tragically. Elizabeth was drawn into the world of drug and alcohol abuse, and she would die in Luger's house after mixing both. After Elizabeth's death, Luger suffered an emotional breakdown and wound up in a wheelchair due to nerve impingement, meaning his days being able to profit from wrestling was well and truly over. Sean O'Haire is one of wrestling's biggest what-ifs. His debut in WCW in 2000 showed an enormous amount of promise as he displayed both huge strength and incredible high-flying ability for his 6'6", 270-pound frame. Alongside his tag team partners in Mark Jindrak and later Chuck Palumbo, O'Haire was one of the few highlights in the dying days of WCW as he lifted the tag team championships on multiple occasions. When WWE purchased WCW, it was great to see they also picked up O'Haire's contract. After participating in the Invasion storyline, O'Haire was sent to developmental before resurfacing on SmackDown in 2003. A series of intriguing vignettes aired in the lead up to O'Hare's re-debut, where he played a devil's advocate character, urging the viewer to not pay their taxes, to cheat on their partners, to break the law, amongst other things. O'Hare played the part perfectly, and that continued when he eventually appeared on TV in the flesh. O'Hare started to show up backstage on SmackDown, encouraging his fellow superstars to subvert the rules. He convinced Spanky to streak and Dawn Marie to flash the audience. As is so often the case, WWE got bored with this interesting gimmick after just a few months and it was dropped. O'Hare was given Roddy Piper as a manager instead. Once that petered out, O'Hare was released in April 2004. Without the structure of wrestling around him, O'Hare's life went into a tailspin. He was charged with assault and battery against his wife, who eventually divorced him and took most of his money. From then on, O'Hare struggled to get jobs in the wrestling business and so had to take unskilled jobs to try and get by. After losing the job that he loved, the woman he loved and all of his money, O'Hare took the tragic decision to end his own life in September 2014. Wrestlers of Ric Flair's generation were expected to act the part both on and off camera. When Ric Flair said he was a limousine-riding, jet-flying, Rolex-wearing, womanising son of a gun, he wasn't lying. No doubt it must have been a lot of fun to be Ric Flair during his prime. He sure was making the kind of megabucks necessary to make that lifestyle happen. Flair had found a renewed lust for life after almost being killed in a plane crash in 1975. The crash broke Flair's back in 3 places, but it could have been so much worse considering the pilot of the plane was killed. From that moment on, Flair decided that he was going to live out loud, and during his prime, he was notorious for going straight from the bar to the gym and from the gym to the wrestling show before going back to the bar again, and he claims he was racking up annual bills of $60,000 per year on limousines and even more on private jets and luxury 5-star hotels while he was on the road. Flair was known for showing up at arenas still hungover and inebriated. However, when his name was called, it was like a switch was flipped and it was showtime. There was nobody more professional in the building. Even after a high-paying return to WWE in the early 2000s, Flair struggled with his health, suffering from congestive heart failure stemming from his earlier alcohol abuse. Flair had difficulty paying rent on his home in Charlotte, North Carolina and was evicted, and then the IRS came knocking asking for $62,000 in unpaid taxes from the 1980s. On top of that, a couple of messy divorces left Flair with very little for himself. It just goes to show that living the gimmick might be fun at the time, but that lifestyle will probably catch up with you in the end. Just Incredible, real name PJ Polanco, had a storied career throughout the 1990s and early 2000s. Polanco appeared in the mainstream when WWE hired him in 1994 and stuck a mask on him, christening him Aldo Montoya, the Portuguese man of war. Try as they did, the character didn't translate well with the fans. Aldo Montoya gained a victory over then Intercontinental Champion Jeff Jarrett to earn a title match which he lost, and he scored an upset victory over Jerry Lawler on an episode of Superstars. Polanco later said that he made next to no money during his first WWE run. "I was really making only peanuts. Let's put it this way, I wasn't making 6 figures to wrestle 300 days a year. And when you're on the road spending that kind of money, you're really losing money." As Montoya slid down the card, WWE denied Polanco his release when he requested it. In hindsight, it was a blessing, as Polanco was traded to ECW back when Paul Heyman had a talent trade deal with WWE. ECW was where Polanco really came into his own as Just Incredible, a grungy, sneering egomaniac of a character that suited the ECW crowd perfectly. Feuds against Tommy Dreamer and his tag team with Lance Storm as the Impact Players were highlights, as was his ECW title victory over Dreamer in the year 2000. When Credible returned to WWE in 2001, he largely got lost in the shuffle of the Invasion storyline, and later as part of a pitiful faction called the X Factor, alongside X-Pac and Albert. His final televised match with WWE was a defeat to Test on a December 2002 episode of Heat. In his time away from the spotlight, Polanco became involved in substance abuse and was powerless to resist either alcohol or narcotics. Polanco resorted to taking intravenous heroin as it was less expensive than other opiates that he could no longer afford, and he was consuming up to a fifth of vodka every day. Luckily these days, Polanco is back on the wagon and doing better than ever. Chris Kanyon began his professional wrestling career in the late 1990s with WCW as Mortis, a character who feuded with infamous Street Fighter knockoff Glacier. Kanyon would abandon the gimmick and join Raven's flock, developing a feud with DDP, who he would later become close friends with in real life. When WWE purchased WCW, they also picked up Kanyon's contract, but he was demoted to wrestling on B shows, rarely ever appearing on Raw or SmackDown, and he was later sidelined with several injuries. After WWE released Kanyon in 2004, he would go on to announce his retirement in 2007. Later, Kanyon claimed that in 2003 he attempted suicide by taking 50 sleeping pills. Kanyon later came out as gay, and he also had bipolar disorder. He was never rehired by WWE or given a second chance by any other organisation at the time. Kanyon eventually committed suicide in 2010 after his depression and lack of work pushed him into financial difficulties. A true legend of 80s wrestling, James Harris played the character of Kamala, the Ugandan giant, on WWE TV on and off until 1993. Coming from poverty, Harris grew up in a small shack on a cotton plantation in Mississippi. To get into the wrestling business, he had to gradually claw his way up the chain with plenty of hardship along the way, before finally reaching WWE and surely his fortune. Harris wrestled against the biggest names in the business, including Hulk Hogan, Randy Savage and The Undertaker during his prime, and even challenged for the World Heavyweight Championship. By the mid-90s, Harris signed with WCW and joined Kevin Sullivan's Dungeon of Doom, a team formed of friends and foes from Hogan's past, to antagonise him before his 1996 heel turn. For a man who wrestled during WWE's golden years during the 80s and WCW at a time when huge contracts were being thrown around, you would be forgiven for expecting Harris to have ridden off into the sunset to enjoy his retirement a rich man. But tragically, it wasn't to be. Harris always maintained that he made a lot less money than his counterparts during the peak of his career. As a heel, Harris was always on the losing end to his babyface opponents. Harris said that a side effect of this was him only making a fraction of the money compared to his peers at the time. After wrestling, Harris worked as a truck driver and reappeared as Kamala in high school gyms. Diabetes complication forced him to have his legs amputated in 2011 and 2012. He relied on disability payments and struggled to meet basic needs after divorcing his wife. Harris sadly passed away in 2020 after a battle with COVID. The only wrestler on this list to have not appeared for WWE during their career, Sharon Spruill's story is absolutely tragic. Spruill came to prominence in WCW in 1999 as Daphne, the deranged, mentally unstable girlfriend of David Flair. After WCW folded, Daphne would reappear on and off for TNA, which is where her problems started. In 2011, Spruill posted a lawsuit against TNA for the litany of injuries she suffered since joining the company in late 2008, including no less than 3 serious concussions, amongst other injuries. Spruill said that management pressured her into taking bumps that she wasn't comfortable with, a claim backed up by other former workers at the time, and she was furious that TNA was refusing responsibility to cover her hospital bills for the injuries. The head injuries that Spruill accumulated during her time in TNA forced her to retire from in-ring activity entirely in 2011, and she struggled to cope financially and mentally in the intervening years before she committed suicide in 2021. Dave Bautista is perhaps one of the last people you would have expected to have lost everything after finishing with wrestling, considering he was WWE World Heavyweight Champion and is now a legitimate movie megastar. It's hard to work out when Batista might have fallen on hard times after quitting WWE for the first time. When Batista was promoted from OVW to the main roster in 2002, he accompanied Devon Dudley, who had just become a reverend, and everyone immediately groaned. Surely there was no future for Devon's bag carrier. It would turn out to be Devon's reverend character that ended up in the toilet, and Batista went on to great things, including joining Triple H, Ric Flair and Randy Orton in Evolution and main eventing WrestleMania. On the way to WrestleMania 26, Batista and John Cena started a feud. As a result, Batista was beaten by Cena in 3 straight matches. After his I Quit match against Cena, Batista left WWE and was absent from the ring for several years. In those years after 2010, Batista spent the fortune he made in the squared circle and then found it difficult to make any more money. I walked out on top, I was very comfortable, I was making a very good living and I walked out. Then I starved for 3 years. I went broke and lost everything, I couldn't get a job. I said I will never go back to wrestling until I prove what I set out to prove, that I could make it as an actor. Later, Batista found his footing in Hollywood, where he was cast in the Guardians of the Galaxy movie and cemented himself as a staple of Marvel's huge budget films. These days, he's doing pretty damn well for himself.